Um, oh, thanks for doing that. I always forget the recording. But so, hi everyone. Here to introduce Quinn Smith. He's a PhD student at University of Wisconsin-Madison, also a good friend of mine. He is a fisheries biologist, and his interests are relating to conservation and management of fish communities, influence of climate change on the ecology, fisheries, population dynamics, lake systems, a little bit of human dimensions in there as well. This is his first year as a PhD student at the UW-Madison, examining climate change and the thermal optical habitat of walleye. So what he's presenting on today is from some of your master's work, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, with that, I'll just let Quinn take it away. And for fish people, we got a fish talk finally.
Awesome. Thanks, Olivia. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm super happy to be able to give this. I'm down in Georgia right now. I'm wrapping up just a little week-long field sampling down here. So maybe next time I'll get to present on that. But for now, as Olivia said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my master's research, which occurred in northern Wisconsin, looking at behavioral responses of a few different sport fish in response to a littoral coarsewoody habitat addition we did. So I'm going to be talking about two different models that we built for this project. One of them is a home range model for these sport fish. And then another one is a multi-state movement model. So looking at home ranges of fish and their movement throughout the lake system. We're going to be coming back to this slide a few times. It's just an overview. I'll give a quick little project overview, talk about the study system a little bit. I'll do some methodology for tracking and modeling, and then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation and talk about home range movement changes, what we found, and then we'll wrap everything up and talk about what we found and some future directions. So whether you're an angler or whether you're someone who enjoys lakes recreationally, you probably think about a few different lake habitats when you start thinking about lakes. You might think about some of the cobble or large boulders that are out on the lake. You might think about submerged macrophytes or weeds. You might think about emergent vegetation like these lily pads. And you might think about coarsewoody habitat, which is really what this project focused on. And I'll talk about that in just a few slides. But while we're thinking about habitats, think about why habitats are important. We know that habitats are important because, like you and myself, these organisms need this healthy living space to survive. They need to be able to grow and they need to be able to reproduce. We know that quality of habitat can influence fish populations, whether this is through behavior or production of fishes. We know that the quality of habitat is important. And it's also interesting to think about different life stages of fish, different species and different seasons, and how their habitat requirements can be different throughout those. So that was really what we focused on in this project, was measuring fish behavior responses to this habitat addition. I know a lot of us may be really in tune with different lake habitats, so I won't get too much into kind of the metaphorical weeds, but I'll get into the physical weeds here in the littoral zone. So this is where we were adding all of our wood in this experiment. This is the littoral zone. So this is a really important interface between terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. We're kind of dealing on the horizontal, kind of, if you look out across the lake, the littoral zone is the area that's closest to the shoreline. It's an area where sunlight penetrates to the bottom of the lake, and so it's often associated with macrophytes, and it's used by many different fish species. So I've been saying coarsewoody habitat. What is this? So coarsewoody habitat is broadly defined as large sticks, branches, and trees that are in the littoral zone of water bodies. Usually in coarsewoody habitat surveys, it's defined as the submergent wood that is larger, or it has a greater diameter than 10 centimeters. For this experiment, when I talk about adding coarsewoody habitat, we were adding whole trees to the lake. So this slide up right now, these two pictures are actually some of the whole trees that we put into the lake, and they varied in both species composition and age. So we put in some trees that were no more than 20 feet tall and some trees that were almost 100 feet tall. And then, so I've introduced this. Now it's kind of, why do we care? What does coarse woody habitat do? Coarse woody habitat is a really important carbon and nutrient source. So as coarse woody habitat degrades in aquatic ecosystems, it releases the nutrients that are built up in that wood. And this provides a surface for periphyton growth. So this little algae over here on the left in that picture can grow using these nutrients, and it'll use that coarse woody habitat as a substrate to grow on, which will then in turn feed some of the larger macro invertebrates in the lake system, and then the fish will then eat those macro invertebrates. So hopefully this GIF is working. You can see this Hexagenia mayfly swimming around. These are some of my favorite macro invertebrates that I was able to sample as part of this work. So this coarse woody habitat can kind of provide this bottom-up nutrient load, and also serves as this really important refuge, foraging area, and spawning habitat when we're talking about fish. So here's another picture of that Hexagenia mayfly with all its gills kind of laid down. This is one of the larger macro invertebrates that we got to sample, but just as a general idea, both large and small macroinvertebrates will use the periphyton and use this coarse woody habitat as an area to grow, feed, and reproduce. So now, kind of a big question, why do we care about this? And not to point fingers or anything, but this is kind of why we care about it. So in the past few decades, we've seen an increase in what's referred to as lakeshore residential development. This is, areas along lake shores where houses get built. And currently in Wisconsin, there's no laws about taking out coarse woody habitat along a shoreline that you own. So this increase in lakeshore residential development has been associated with the thinning of riparian forests, so taking away trees that are close to the waterline, and reduced littoral zone coarse woody habitat. So this is really associated with this increase in lakeshore residential development is associated with reductions of allochthonous inputs of nutrients into these aquatic ecosystems. So there was a study done, this was the Northern Highland Lakes District. This was up in northern Wisconsin in Vilas County. This graph is from Zach Lawson did some work up there back in the early 2010s. And coarse woody habitat density is on the y-axis, so that's logs per kilometer. And then lakeshore residential development density is on the x-axis in buildings per kilometer. And you can see there's this really strong relationship where as lakeshore residential development increases, coarse woody habitat density drops off very quickly. Where you have high lakeshore residential development, you have low amounts of coarse woody habitat. So there's been a few studies that kind of built up to this and built off of it, dealing with removal of this coarse woody habitat, looking at its kind of larger influences on the fish within the habitat. So these coarse woody habitat removal studies have been associated with the functional collapse of the forage fish in the system. Most oftentimes this was yellow perch. And this was thought to have been through a few different mechanisms. One was this loss of refuge, where all of a sudden the perch don't have anywhere to find refuge from predators. And it has been shown there was a natural drought that occurred in a few of these studies where you get this concentration of predator-prey interactions. As the lake level drops, you lose that littoral zone coarse woody habitat, and you get this concentration of predator-prey interactions. This has also been associated with larger predator home ranges. So these predators were thought to have switched to a roving lifestyle as coarse woody habitat was removed. So if we look at this here, the perch up in the northern part of this lake are not in jail. Those are some coarse woody habitat sticks. And we have our predator, the largemouth bass, down below. And basically, it's thought that as this coarse woody habitat is removed, these predators are more able to find the fish as they move around the system with that loss of refuge. So on the flip side of this, there's also been some coarse woody habitat addition studies done in northern Wisconsin. And these addition studies have been associated with lower percentage of empty fish stomachs. So both predator or as we see them, these piscivorous fish, these predators are eating more, and fish such are forage fish are eating more macroinvertebrates. And this greater coarse woody habitat used by both predators and prey. So it was found that these predators were using the coarse woody habitat as this really important kind of interface between habitats where they were more able to efficiently forage. And along with that, it was found that there were these smaller predator home ranges. They were concentrating all of their energy into foraging kind of in a smaller area along this habitat interface, using that coarse woody habitat as an ambush site. If you are a fisherman or you have family or friends who are anglers, you may know that coarse woody habitat additions are not often treated as deliberate experiments. So this is really interesting. So my family in Minnesota used to always take our Christmas tree after the holidays and go tie some cinder blocks to it and sink it in the lake to make fish cribs. So that's not a deliberate experiment. That's just kind of using the idea that these fish will be attracted to them. These coarse woody habitat addition studies were done on 2 lakes in northern Wisconsin, Little Rock and Camp, and actually Little Rock in the upper portion of this figure was a removal, but it had really high density of logs in the lower basin, that control basin. So Camp Lake was actually a coarse woody habitat addition. So the northernmost basin was the control, and the lower portion of the lake got this coarse woody habitat addition. So we'll be coming back to these in just a few minutes. But so remember Camp and Little Rock. And so Little Rock was the removal, Camp Lake was the coarse woody habitat addition. So in this figure, all of these little small white dots are actually trees that were measured. So there was a large amount of logs per kilometer of shoreline in the control of Little Rock and in the addition basin of Camp. So with all of these studies in northern Wisconsin and across the globe, there are a few knowledge gaps that we wanted to focus in on. Previous work is really focused on behavior, fish behavior in low diversity fish communities, so most often largemouth bass and yellow perch, and it's often focused on just one aspect of behavioral change. So often it was home ranges. So it's kind of known that coarse woody habitat attracts fish, but there are a few unknowns. Is this attraction long-term? Does it depend on the original habitats present within the lake? Does it depend on life stage of different fishes? Does it depend on the season? Does it depend on previous littoral zone conditions? And so this led us to some of the questions, kind of our guiding question that we addressed in our objectives for this project. So really our guiding question was, what are the effects of littoral coarse woody habitat addition on sport fish behavior? So we were studying smallmouth bass, walleye, and muskie in this study, which we'll get into in just a second. But we wanted to test for these short-term pre and post manipulation behavioral responses. We wanted to look at both home range and movement changes within the lake of muskie, smallmouth bass, and walleye to this littoral zone coarse woody habitat addition. And so when we think about home range and movement, why are these important? So the movements and the distribution of fish within aquatic ecosystems can be really important for understanding ecological interactions. The knowledge of species movement among various habitats is important to understand life histories. You can really delve into ecological niches of fish, and it's useful for identifying conservation and management plans. So that's why we focused on home range. So let's get into our study site. So the lake that this coarse woody habitat edition was performed on was in the Northern Highlands Lake District, way up in Vilas County, northern Wisconsin. There's about 2,500 lakes within an area of about 3,500 square kilometers. This is one of the most populous areas of lakes per land area in the world. And it's also one of the best studied lake districts in the world. And this is where this was the home of those other coarse woody habitat studies. So Camp Lake and Little Rock Lake. And so specifically, this was our study system. This is Sanford Lake in Vilas County, Wisconsin. I often joke around that it's like a little mini Lake Superior. If you squint hard enough, it kind of looks like Lake Superior, but it is much, much smaller. So this lake's only 88 acres. It does have a deep hole of 52 feet. So it's for its size, it's actually quite a deep lake. It has an inlet and an outlet, and really a community of kind of these larger fish. It was mainly muskie, smallmouth bass, and walleye. For forage fish, it was kind of thinking of our smaller fish. It's a lot of bluegill and yellow perch. And it was situated on a private property, which was really nice because there was a mandatory creel. So there was relatively little fishing pressure on this lake, but a mandatory creel means that as people would go, or as anglers would go and harvest fish, all of those fish were processed by this private country club. So we knew what fish were coming out of the system. So for the habitat addition was done along the northern shoreline of the lake. So all that red outline from point 1 to 2. We added about 140 trees. We mimicked the surrounding forest landscape with the addition. So it was about 87% coniferous trees and about 13% deciduous trees. And calculated out, this is about 400 trees per kilometer of shoreline. So to put that into perspective, that number, because 400 trees per kilometer of shoreline might seem like a lot, might seem like not a lot. We can look at the density of coarse woody habitat in previous studies. So like I talked about with Camp and Little Rock, so Camp Lake Control was kind of at the low end of the coarse woody habitat spectrum. There were only 41 logs per kilometer, where the addition to Camp Lake was 141 logs per kilometer. Little Rock, the removal, so where coarse woody habitat was taken out, it dropped it from, the control had an original density of 344 logs per kilometer, but the removal dropped it all the way down to 128 logs per kilometer. And the addition that was done on Sanford, so this project, we were looking at about 400, maybe a little bit greater. So we are way on the other end of the coarse woody habitat spectrum. And just for some more added context, generally developed lakes within the Midwest sit somewhere between 20 to 81 logs per kilometer, whereas undeveloped lakes in the Midwest sit at a much higher density of about 380 logs per kilometer. So we were going kind of even above and beyond this undeveloped lake density of coarse woody habitat. So there were a lot of logs added to this lake, given the amount of shoreline we were working with. All right, now for everyone's favorite part of the presentation, let's meet what kind of fish we studied here. So first up is the muskellunge, or the muskie. So this fish is really, it's shaped like a torpedo. It is really made for lion weight ambush. So thinking about the coarse woody habitat we added, and thinking about our questions, we thought that muskies in this study may utilize that coarse woody habitat as an ambush site. So we thought that they would be highly associated with this coarse woody habitat. And I wouldn't be a fisheries biologist if I didn't share some photos of my study fish. So I'll be selling this picture. This is the only picture you'll probably ever see of me without a beard. I'll be selling it after the presentation for 10 bucks a pop, and you can You can use that to blackmail me in the future. So next up is the smallmouth bass. So these fish are really similar to largemouth bass. And we thought that they would utilize, or kind of they would follow the same path as the largemouth bass that as previously studied in coarse woody habitat additions. So we thought that they may be highly associated with this coarse woody habitat, might use that. Their home ranges might become smaller as they use that as an ambush site for prey items. So I got to live at Trout Lake Station, which is a fantastic research station in northern Wisconsin. And this is right off the dock. So it's truly an awesome place to spend the summers. And I'm very grateful for being able to spend the summers up there. And finally, we have everyone's favorite fish, the walleye. This was kind of the curveball for the experiment. Walleye are generally associated with cooler, deeper waters, not so much the littoral zone, but they've been known to use the littoral zone for some foraging on DL cycles, so on daily cycles. But we hypothesized that these fish might not be as strongly associated with the coarse woody habitat because they're using offshore zones a little bit more. And before starting up this research in Wisconsin, you know, I was a true blue Minnesotan. I thought, why would anyone ever want to do research in Wisconsin? And this photo is from about a week after I got to Wisconsin. As I let that fish go, I kind of went, yeah, this is maybe why people would want to do research in Wisconsin. So we know about the coarse woody habitat. And the addition, we know about the different fish that we are studying. So let's just really quickly touch on a few short-term behavior hypotheses. We'll be coming back to this again, but just to kind of orient you, we have our large fish over on the left. There's this disturbance, this coarse woody habitat addition in the ecosystem. We thought that there might be a few different ways that this shakes out. So it was quite possible that the coarse woody habitat may be too complex. You know, we're adding a lot of trees. And over on the right, so HR stands for home range and ER stands for exchange rate or movement. You can think about that as movement towards the coarse woody habitat. So if the coarse woody habitat is too complex, maybe home range increases as fish are moving around and exchange rate towards the coarse woody habitat decreases. Just because they're not, you know, they know that that's too complex and they can't access food items or forage fish within the coarse woody habitat. It was also possible that these fish used the coarse woody habitat to forage or spawn, in which case we hypothesized we might see a decrease in home range as these fish kind of utilize that area around the coarse woody habitat in just that area. And we might see an increase in exchange rate towards the coarse woody habitat. So fish are kind of willing to move back towards that coarse woody habitat. And then of course, if there was no influence of the coarse woody habitat, we wouldn't expect changes in home range or exchange rates. And if both home range or exchange rates, if they both increased, this may indicate a switch to a roving lifestyle, where these fish are moving around the ecosystem more, but are moving past that coarse woody habitat area a little bit more. Or if they both decrease, that may indicate that these fish are moving away from the coarse woody habitat and aren't going near the coarse woody habitat. They're not utilizing that. And if both home range and exchange rates increased, or if both of them decreased, that may be indicative of a longer term response. So I'm going to really quickly touch on tracking and modeling before we get into our results, just so you have an understanding of kind of how we got to this point. So the tracking that I'm going to be talking about today was all done with radio telemetry. This is a form of active tracking. It's fantastic. We implant radio tags into these fish, and this is a way of studying these animals without disrupting their normal habits. We don't have to go and sample them every time we want to find them. So usually we would capture fish with fyke nets in the early spring. We'd implant a radio tag into the fish. It's a little bit larger than a AA battery. So these were just implanted in larger fish. And that tag will give out a unique radio signal. So these radio signals can be tracked, and you can, track one individual and then track the next individual. So these fish were tracked 2 times a week, May through October, for the 3 years that I'll talk about in just a second. So in 2017, 2018, and 2019, we tracked fish. This table just shows the number of fish we had tagged. Relatively few muskies were tagged during the study. The population estimate on the lake was 33 fish. So we were really happy to be able to tag 4 of those fish in 2019, but relatively low sample size of muskie for this study. Smallmouth bass and walleye, we were all dealing with anywhere from 6 to 9 fish during each of the year. So small sample sizes. However, this can really represent a population when we get into modeling. And it's really, really expensive to implant these tags, but the nice part is you can find these fish at any time. Like I said, if you want to go out at 3 a.m. and track your fish, you can do that. So this is a picture of one of the radio tags getting implanted. Here's a picture of that same fish, and you can see that there's a trailing whip antenna coming out of the belly of the fish, and that's actually where the radio signal is given off. And this is how you track them. So it looks like I went and stole this off of someone's roof, but this is not a satellite receiver. This is how we attenuate those radio signals. So there's a little box strapped to my shoulder, and I can change what frequency we're looking for and track these fish. It's a really cool way to be able to track individuals in ecological settings. Here's one of the muskies that we tagged. Again, you can see that trailing whip antenna kind of coming out of the belly of the fish. It was a really simple surgery. There was just about a 3-inch incision made, and we just used 2 sutures after the radio tag was implanted. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about experimental design and modeling, kind of what models we decided to pursue for this. So this was a 3-year study period, and within each of those years, there was a 3-part season for both home range estimates and exchange rates. So we'll start with the years. So we had 2017, 2018, and 2019. The coarse woody habitat was added during the summer of 2018. So we have 2017 as a pre-manipulation phase, 2018 as kind of a during manipulation phase, and then summer 2019 as a post-manipulation phase. So this coarse woody habitat was added kind of smack dab in the middle of the early season portion of 2018. So, or the early summer portion. So within each of these years, our early summer phase usually started early to mid-May whenever we were able to get out on the water after ice off. That lasted until June 15th. We looked at midsummer for each of, calculating both home ranges and exchange rates of fish. So midsummer was June 16th through August 31st. And then late summer was September 1st until whenever we were it got too cold to track these fish, usually late September to early October. And these 3 different, this 3-part kind of seasonal aspect of these models was used not arbitrarily, but also coincided with the early season spawn, and then used water temperatures to kind of delineate between early summer, midsummer, and late summer. So for home range estimates, again, we used radio telemetry to calculate home ranges. And we set out to kind of compare and contrast 3 different forms of home range estimation: the minimum convex polygon method, the kernel density estimate method, and then a limited kernel density estimate method. And very briefly, kernel density estimates and minimum convex polygons are standards in ecological studies when it comes to calculating home range. But in these small systems with a lot of complex shoreline, there's often a lot of overlap with land. So you can see in this figure here, each of these white dots are location events. The light blue polygon is the minimum convex polygon, and then the dark blue area is the kernel density estimate. And so you can see that there's a lot of overlap with land. So we decided to use this limited kernel density estimate. For the small system, it's more accurate than the minimum convex polygon method, and it avoids a lot, but not all of the land when calculating home range. So the way that this works is in this figure, this was a fish from 2017. Each of these white dots are location events throughout the season. Each data point represents kind of a weight, and more of these data points together means a larger weight. So the home range would be calculated to be more extreme or larger in this southern portion where all these location events are kind of concentrated together when compared to the northern portion of the lake where there are less location events kind of clumped together. So that is how, for the rest of the presentation, I'll be reporting on just these limited kernel density estimates. And then finally, for movement estimates, we used multi-state exchange models to calculate movement of fish throughout the lake. So this was really focused on calculating the exchange rates and the retention rates between different states or different locations within the lake. And it estimates movement from one day to the next using this bi-weekly radio telemetry data. So this was because we were able to go out and track all of our fish. The most parsimonious models were recapture only. And the most parsimonious models were all dependent on state. So when we talk about movement, there's 3 different possibilities. A fish's movement can be, or whatever organism you're tracking, the movement can be constant. So maybe you're moving from, one site like the coarse-woody habitat to the offshore at a constant rate. It doesn't matter what state or what location you're originally tracked in, all your movements are constant. So movement can also be dependent on state, which all of our models were dependent on state, where maybe fish are more likely to move from the offshore to the coarse-woody habitat and are less likely to move from the coarse-woody habitat to the offshore. Movement probabilities can also be dependent on state and time, which factors not only your tracking, so where you were tracked in the lake, but also adds a time series to that as well. So maybe movements are different early season or late season, but everything ended up being dependent on state within these movement models. So to set this up, we divided the lake into 3 sections. So we had coarse-woody habitat, where we added the coarse-woody habitat in 2018. We had the near shores area, which was the southern portion of the lake where coarse-woody habitat was not added. And we had the offshore area. So here is Sanford Lake again, divided up into a few different regions. So we had the near shore coarse-woody habitat. Again, this is where we added wood. We had the near shore, which was on the other side of the lake where we did not add wood. We had 2 offshore areas that were greater than 4 meters. And we didn't use 4 meters arbitrarily. This lake, when it fully stratifies during summer, is actually anoxic below 4 meters. So there's no oxygen below 4 meters in this lake, which is why we use that 4-meter cutoff as our way to designate these offshore areas. All right, so now we can get into what we found as far as home ranges and movement changes throughout the course of this study. All right, so we'll start with home ranges. These are the different species home ranges by year. So these are notched box plots. So the median of the data is the dark line. Notches are the 95% confidence intervals. So when you have the little horns, as you can see for the muskellunge in 2017, the box plot has little horns. So those 95% confidence intervals just extend beyond the solid box. And the solid boxes are the interquartile ranges, and whiskers are the minimum and maximum, or in the case where there's outliers, they represent the 25th and 75th percentile if those outliers are present. And so we're going to be looking at same type of plots for the next few slides. So just to get us oriented, on the y-axis is our home range On the x-axis for this graph are our different species. So we have muskie on the left, smallmouth bass in the middle, walleye on the right. And then the colors of these boxes represent the year. So 2017, which was pre-coarse woody habitat addition, 2018, which is when the coarse woody habitat was added, and 2019, which was kind of our year after. And so we can see that for these three different species, we see an increase in home ranges over time. And there's major differences, there's significant differences when we compare 2017 to 2018 and 2017 to 2019. So we can see that in all of these home ranges are increasing over time, and at the species level, walleye tend to have this smaller home range than both muskies and smallmouth bass. So we can break this down a little bit more and look at the seasonal home ranges over the course of the year. So again, home range is on the y-axis, the x-axis is now our season, with early summer on the left, midsummer in the middle, late summer on the right. We can see that this midsummer area represents larger home ranges for these three species over the course of our 3 years. Then we can bring our species back into the mix and look at their home ranges seasonally. So we can see that muskie are relatively constant throughout the seasons, but smallmouth bass and walleye kind of show this seasonal change in home ranges, where their home ranges are larger in the midsummer, but lower in the early and the late summer. So muskie have, they have this constant home range over the course of the summer, but they're higher than, or they have a larger home range than the smallmouth bass and the walleye in early summer and late summer. So to visualize these plots is kind of interesting. So if we think about what we saw in those figures, we saw that our home ranges were increasing over the course of the year. And so in these figures, muskie will always be on the top panel, smallmouth bass will always be in the middle panel, walleye will always be on the lower panel. So this is 2017, and you don't need to know kind of individuals. I know that the legend is a little hard to read, but if we look at patterns and kind of where fish are going, we can see that there's a lot of aversion of the offshore areas in 2017. When we bring 2018 up, we can see that all of a sudden we see a lot of movement through that offshore area. A lot of those home ranges are kind of now encroaching on the offshore area in 2018 for all three species. When we move to 2019, we can see a lot of home ranges in those offshore areas. So we looked at this and we went, okay, so we know that our home ranges are increasing. Let's look at if these figures that we have right now actually coincide with movement data when we build models from it. And so we wanted to estimate the movement with these multi-state models like I talked about. Again, there's the coarse woody habitat area, the nearshore area, and the offshore area in our lake. And so these were radiotelemetry data that were pooled, that looked at pooled fish, and then we'll get into species specific and seasonal. So this figure will be up again, but these are the colors that I wanted to associate, that are associated with the stacked bar plots that I'll be showing next, where offshore is this blue color, coarse woody habitat is this dark brown color, and the nearshore is this lighter brown color. So when we just look at raw detections, in 2017, we see there's about 31% of our detections are in the coarse woody habitat. Many more of the detections are in the nearshore. We had about 64% of our detections in the nearshore area, and then very few in the offshore area. Again, 2017 is pre-coarse woody habitat addition. In 2018, right after the coarse woody habitat was added, we saw that detections in that coarse woody habitat area decreased and detections in the offshore actually increased. And so those trends were followed in 2019, where coarse woody habitat detections were much lower than 2017. Near shore, so the other side of the lake, detections were lower as well, and there was an increased number of detections in the offshore area. So these are all of our pooled fish. So for these stacked bar plots, we'll go through 2017, 2018, and 2019. The daily probability is over on the y-axis, and the x-axis is actually the habitat. So either coarse woody habitat, near shore, or offshore. And so the colors kind of correspond to whether they are leaving the coarse woody habitat, which is in, or leave to, so they're traveling to the coarse woody habitat, which is in dark brown. Light brown, which is leaving, so moving to the near shore. This light blue is leaving to the offshore area. Or just to simplify it, if you were detected, or if this fish was detected in the coarse woody habitat, it's not possible to move to the coarse woody habitat. So if the fish stayed in the coarse woody habitat, or was modeled to stay in the coarse woody habitat from one day to the next, then we just called that remain. So in 2017, we can see that fish are very likely to remain in the coarse woody habitat and the near shore, and less likely to remain in the offshore area if they were detected there. But these fish detected in the offshore area are almost equally likely to move to the coarse woody habitat or the near shore. So post coarse woody habitat addition in 2019, we can see that fish are less likely to remain in the coarse woody habitat or the near shore, and they're much more likely to remain in this offshore area. If the fish were to leave the offshore area, it was modeled that fish were more likely to leave to the offshore. So kind of shows that these fish weren't modeled to be moving from the offshore area to the coarse woody habitat in 2018. And we see very similar trends in 2019, where fish are less likely to remain in the coarse woody habitat or the near shore regions of the lake, much more likely to remain in the offshore compared to 2017, and not very likely to move from the offshore to the coarse woody habitat. So when we looked at these in terms of specific to species and specific to seasons, so muskellunge and walleye were much more likely to remain in habitats when compared to smallmouth bass. Smallmouth bass were very nomadic. They tended to move around the lake more. Seasonally, generally retention rates increased and exchange rates decreased as summer progressed. So early summer, fish were moving around a lot more when compared to the midsummer and late summer seasons. So let's go over just a few take-home points about what we talked about. So as far as home range goes, we saw that it was quite different from other studies. Whereas other coarse woody habitat studies saw a decrease in home range, we saw an increase. And we saw a lot of these differences between when we compared 2017 to 2018, when we compared 2017 to 2019. We also saw some species-specific home range changes and seasonality. So we saw that these walleyes had, kind of this lower home range, possibly suggesting that they're spatially distant from this coarse woody habitat. We saw larger home ranges in the midsummer, which may be this departure from a possible early season kind of spawning home range. And then it possibly suggests that by late summer, these fish, quote unquote, found their home ranges. So when we look at our movement rates, again, we see a lot of these changes from when comparing 2017 to 2018 and 2017 to 2019. We had this almost evaporation of our exchange rate, this loss of exchange rate between the offshore area and the coarse woody habitat after coarse woody habitat was added to that region of the lake. We saw this increase over time in the probability of staying offshore. And it's most likely that these fish were not staying offshore due to that low oxygen. I think that it's more possible that as we were tracking fish during our tracking events, we were catching them as they moved. They used that offshore area to move from one area of the lake to the other. We also saw species-specific movement changes and seasonality. So these smallmouth were, again, kind of nomadic and more likely to move. And all of our fish, or all of the fish studied here, were modeled to move west as the summer progressed. So if we go back to our hypotheses, I think it's very clear that we saw this increase in home range and a decrease in the exchange rate towards that coarse woody habitat, and which may suggest that we made a really, really good refuge for a lot of the forage fish. These trees that we added a much larger amount per kilometer of shoreline than other studies. And so it's quite possible that as we added this coarse woody habitat, the large fish increased their home range and decreased their exchange rate towards the coarse woody habitat. But these small fish, these forage fish, may be using that coarse woody habitat as forage and as refuge. You know, if you have predators out in the lake and all of a sudden a new apartment goes up and it has an all-you-can-eat buffet and none of the predators can get to you, you know, I'd like to be there if I was one of those forage fish. Again, this is just a hypothesis, but it's quite possible that over time, this coarse woody habitat may degrade. So it's important to look at this in kind of a large ecological view. It doesn't mean that this is set in stone. So as far as management implications are concerned, it was shown here, we found that these complex species-specific behavioral responses can be expected. And again, this long-term ecological view as important. We added this really, really complex habitat to the lake, but what happens as that refuge degrades? You know, if we are making this great area for forage fishes, as time goes on and the trees degrade, will we be adding, you know, kind of these large forage fish to the lake that are kind of up for the eating? So are these larger fish going to use that as the trees degrade? We may see additional behavioral changes as time goes on. We hit the ecosystem with a pretty big hammer, and I think it's also important to note that this may still be the disturbance period. We may have, you know, in a few years, things will settle out and we may see different behavioral responses than we currently, or that we saw in the past few years. So with that, I'd like to give a few acknowledgements. So everyone on this list was definitely responsible for helping this project. I'd like to especially thank my research advisors, give a shout out to them, Tom Hrovick, Greg Sass, and Joel Hoffman. I had a ton of support from my cohort at the University of Minnesota Duluth, so thanks to all of them. And then everybody at the Escanaba Research Station and everyone who helped on the Flame Crew do some more intensive sampling on this lake. And then to all of our funders as well, thank you so much. I mentioned that I was at Trout Lake Station doing this research, and I want to give a big shout out to the community that was present up there in 2018 and 2019. So thanks to everyone, even the folks that couldn't make the end of the year picture. And I want to say thanks to all of you as well for getting to listen to this. Thank you for having me. My email is up right here, but I'd also love to take any questions that you may have.
Yeah, thanks, Quinn. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or you can pop them in the chat and we can take a look at that as well.
Hi, Quinn. My name's John Hebert. I am the lake habitat consultant for Minnesota DNR.
Yeah, hey, John.
We've had a lot of discussions about shorelines and understanding the impacts of development, but the inability to actually, if coarse woody habitat is what in fact is limiting, how can you physically get enough of it into these lakes to make meaningful changes? And so we've been working a lot on trying to work on watershed changes, trying to maybe improve lake water quality to improve submersed vegetation. Because while coarse woody habitat's very important for aquatic habitats, so is this submersed vegetation. And in your opinion, again, I haven't been out on these lakes, I don't know the size or anything, was there significant amounts of submerged vegetation? Was there other habitat present on these lakes other than the coarse woody habitat? I was just curious because I haven't, seen these basins or anything. But thank you for
Yeah.
presenting your results.
Yeah, thank you, John. That's a fantastic question. So in this lake, there's very little development. However, all of the coarse woody habitat, and this is why this lake was chosen, all of the coarse woody habitat was highly degraded. We were dealing with very low amounts, much lower than undeveloped lakes in the area, and it was all not complex. So there was this really healthy population of submergent macrophytes. And this was selected as this coarse woody habitat addition to kind of delve into that question, and I think it's much more complex than, will coarse woody habitat govern everything? I think that it may be a large part of it, and that's what this study set out, and this future study on this lake will set out to do. So there's a 3-part coarse woody habitat addition on this lake. This lake will get a coarse woody habitat addition again, and I think now we're down to 3 years. And there's a few different reasons for that. Number one is that this coarse woody habitat addition that we did was very large, and it may not be feasible on a lot of lakes with a lot of residential development. So we wanted to see what would happen if future management agencies were to add this really large amount of coarse woody habitat. And the future additions to this lake are actually to test the hypothesis that there is some kind of level of coarse woody habitat where adding more won't help out. So I'm really interested to see how this develops, how the system develops over the next few years. But I think that the coarse woody habitat is really important. But as you mentioned, that submergent vegetation is also really important. So in a lot of these northern lakes that have low development or undeveloped, there is a really healthy population or really healthy areas of macrophyte abundance.
Thank you very much, Quinn.
Yeah, thanks, John. It looks like Jaren had a question in chat. Could you explain how the addition of coarse woody debris would make the offshore areas less anoxic, or i.e. more habitable for your study species? Conveniently, we think of additional nutrient inputs into a lake as a driver of lake anoxia. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the question, Jaren. So this is really interesting. So this anoxia that we saw was, as the lake was stratified during the summer, it was constantly at that 4-meter mark, whether it was in 2017 or 2018 or 2019. We never really saw that move, which is that kind of layer of anoxia, or that level where anoxia took over. We never saw that move from about 4 meters. So I'm unsure if this, huge addition of nutrients would influence that. But I think that if it will in the future, we'll see that over time. I don't know if I would have seen it in the 3 years that we were out there measuring, because so many of the trees that we added were deciduous. I went out there this year, and when I went out there, a lot of the coniferous trees were just starting to lose kind of their final needles. So they were really holding on to that. If I think that huge addition of nutrients into the lake were to change that level of anoxia in the offshore area, I would hypothesize that it kind of was stretched out over such a long time that we may not be able to measure it, or it may not have a huge magnitude of change.
All right, anyone, any last couple questions for Quinn? And if you have any too that you aren't sure, you can, his email's up there as well.
Yeah, I'm always happy to chat with anyone over email, or if you're just like really psyched on it, we can set up a Zoom meeting. I'm always looking for to productively procrastinate my current studies.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was curious about, have you looked into or thought about it all using like non-organic coarse material, much like I don't know, something that wouldn't degrade and wouldn't add nutrient inputs, but would have the same structural benefit to the lake shores?
Yeah, so this has been thought about, to my knowledge, a few different times, and uh, it has been used more so as like riprap, as a way to help not stop but lessen the amount of shoreline degradation we see. I think that coarse woody habitat is really focused in on as kind of the primo this like primo littoral zone habitat, because it does provide that bottom up kind of nutrient. As it degrades, we see that more periphyton colonize it, more macroinvertebrates will use that, and then fish can feed on those macroinvertebrates. So we see this kind of as a way to possibly increase the production of an ecosystem. I think that in many areas where shoreline degradation is becoming a problem, and it is, as the climate continues to change and warm. I'm seeing more and more, I think everyone is seeing more and more of this erosion of the shoreline, and I think that that is where a lot of management is going to be directed at next. But for these ecological studies, coarse woody habitat is kind of seen as kind of the primo habitat to add. But yeah, there's definitely other non-organic materials that are added to the littoral zone.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, it looks like Madeline put something in chat. Are there any strong opinions from the fishing community towards or against woody habitat addition around snags? Or is it positive for more habitat / food availability for fish species? Awesome question, Madeline. I think that most of the anglers that I have interacted with react fairly positively to coarse woody habitat additions. Again, there was relatively little fishing pressure on this lake, but when we did see anglers out there, they were curious about what we were doing. And I think there is this kind of known information within the angling community that this coarse woody habitat attracts fishes. And so most of the people were really excited that we were adding coarse woody habitat. I can definitely see the flip side of that coin, where people might say, I don't want to lose my my fishing lures or my bait in the coarse woody habitat. But most people were very excited that we were adding coarse woody habitat to this lake. That's a great kind of social aspect question.
Okay, well, sitting right around 1. So if anyone has any last minute questions, otherwise, thanks so much, Quinn, for coming and giving a talk. Really appreciate it, and have a safe, long drive back from Georgia.
Yeah, we've got about 21 hours in the car that we get to do tomorrow, so it'll be fun. So
Yep.
yeah, thanks everyone for having me. Thanks for some awesome questions, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your Friday and enjoy the weekend.